Good morning, one and all. I'm Christopher Cohen, coming to you from QA Wolf, and on today's episode of Wolfed, we're in the studio with Irina Krechmer, who is currently investing in new startups and was most recently CTO at Blue Apron. We cover a whole lot in an hour, including maintaining shared cultures and values as teams expand, shifting an organization from measuring outputs to measuring outcomes, and the importance of leadership communities. It was a fascinating conversation. I think you're really going to enjoy it. Let's dive in with Irina Krechmer. Hello, Irina.
Hi, Christopher. Thank you for having me.
Thank you so much for joining us. Very excited to dig in with you here. And usually for me, what that starts with is sort of trying to get a sense of what your initial exposure to software engineering was and what that looked like for you. Can you tell us a little bit about how you got started in the tech industry?
So you'll be surprised, but I had not seen a computer before college.
Wow.
No. I grew up in Ukraine, and at the time, though I'm probably aging myself a little bit, very few people could afford a personal computer. Having said that, let me tell you kind of what brought me to the industry. It was quite simple. For me, software engineering is like this perfect mix of science, problem solving, and creativity. I was good at math. I liked creating things. I even saw my own clothes. And so, it felt like the right thing for me. And, it kind of brought together things that I really like doing. And one more thing, I'm an introvert. And so I thought that as a software engineer, I would be able to just kind of sit in the corner quietly and write code and not talk to people much, which is ironic because as a leader, these days, most of my time is actually spent talking to people. But, it still worked out well.
I was going to say exactly that, right? That's interesting because, I think maybe a lot of introverts have that in mind, or maybe there's even a stereotype that engineers are introverts. Yep. But of course, that doesn't really stand up too well to the leadership path, right?
Not at all. And frankly, not even, setting the leadership path aside, the best engineers are actually the ones who do talk to people, who do talk to product and business and customers, if at all possible, and really embrace the why and, what they're building, not just kind of sitting quietly and executing on what somebody tells them to do.
You said you didn't see a computer really before college. What did that look like as you first were getting exposed to, maybe your first language or your first engineering course? What spoke to you beyond what you've already mentioned about like, hey, well, even if I've never had any experience with this is the career path for me? How did you choose that would be your future?
Honestly, it just felt right as I started kind of with my first jobs. Being able to put something in front of the customer, being able to build something that is going to improve people's lives, even just a little bit, even, in maybe one small particular area, that's just so incredibly rewarding. And, once I felt that, once that really kind of became part of, what this role is about, what this job is about, I never looked back.
That's wonderful. And so I guess as you're entering the field and you're in these early dev roles, what was your first glimpse into more of a leadership role? I mean, did it start to set into your sights early that you would be moving from IC to management, or did it come as a surprise to you, or what did that look like?
So I think a lot of us kind of face the same situation where, when I was first asked to take on a managerial role, not only was I not ready for it, I didn't even know if I wanted it. I was perfectly happy being a senior software engineer. I enjoyed what I was doing. I presumably was good at it because that's why, a lot of us get promoted. Quite frankly, I wasn't sure if I should take the job. What ultimately made me take the job was that, I had really great relationships with my manager. And I thought, you know what, if he thought I was going to be able to do it, then, the least I could do is give it a try. And so that's what I did. And honestly, made every mistake in the book. I immediately felt like I had two jobs. I continued executing on my IC tasks, IC level deliverables, and I also was now responsible, for managerial tasks. And that was pre-agile. So, my team was actually sitting and waiting for me to dole out tasks while I was figuring things out. So definitely did not do very well kind of to start with. I wasn't immediately a natural at it, let's put it this way. But over time, I started figuring it out, right? I started figuring out how to delegate. I started figuring out how to remove myself from a critical path. Learn a lot from my own mistake. And, you mentioned the mentorship program at the beginning. That's one big reason I became so passionate about mentorship, is to help others avoid all those mistakes that I personally made.
I have to imagine it's pretty difficult to make that detachment from the IC responsibilities, to put the trust in your team to actually carry out those sorts of things, on a day-to-day level, when you're so used to that as an IC yourself until this point. Was there an aha moment? Was there a light bulb moment that helped you really cross that gap and say, okay, I really do have to be hands off. I have to step into this management role and let go of the day-to-day?
So I didn't immediately become hands off. I think it is important for an engineering manager to continue being hands on and, being in touch with the code and, really understand what your team is doing. The critical piece there is not be on the critical path, right? You can no longer take on the most important, the most critical tasks, because inevitably you're going to get pulled off on performance issues, strategic conversations. People are going to have questions for you that are going to distract you. So you just cannot be on the critical path. And I think that was a big realization. I'm definitely not saying step away from the code. I did ultimately do it, but I was kind of at the senior director level when I did that. As an engineering manager, I definitely encourage people to, to still be as hands-on as possible, just not quite on the critical path.
And so I guess then you said as your management career grows and you are taking on more director, senior director, maybe even vice president roles, what is that difference where you do have to truly be hands off versus where you're still sort of doing some more in the weeds work?
I think it really depends on what you can fit in, right? Your primary role as a senior leader, especially as you pointed out, as you get to senior director, VP, CTO level, your primary goal is you set context for the team, right? The team needs to understand the strategy, the team needs to understand all the whys, right? And you need to really be very deliberate about making sure the team gets it and the team understands it, because they need to be able to make 100 different decisions every day, right? And for them to make those decisions and not having to ask you a question and not having you or their managers be involved in every single day-to-day decision, they need to have the right context. They need to understand the strategy. They need to understand the architecture. So your primary goal is do everything possible for that to be clear, right? However long that take, however much effort that takes. It could be, working with the rest of the executive team. It could be working with product. It could be working with customers, but you need to figure that out. Your goal is to help people be their best. Like, you can no longer be the smartest person in the room. You can no longer rely on yourself to make all of those decisions, but you need to be able to empower your team, and you need to be able to create an environment where your team can grow and be the best they can be. That means removing blocks. That means creating opportunities for learning. That means creating opportunity for failing and learning from failures. All of that is your primary job, right? If that leaves you time to code, go forth and conquer. Still cannot be on a critical path. That's kind of how I see it. You can still do it, but not at the expense of all those other responsibilities.
That makes sense. And I think you've highlighted something really important when it comes to what does it mean to be a manager managing ICs versus what does it mean to be a manager managing managers. And I guess I'm curious, in your experience, as that chain continues, what do you think were the quintessential differences between when it did come to being a senior director versus being a vice president versus actually being a CTO? Like, most recently, you were CTO of Blue Apron. I mean, what do those differences in your responsibilities look like day to day in your experience?
It's a great question. I mean, I think it really comes down to um, the the depth, right? As an IC or as a manager of ICs, you really should be involved kind of very deeply into day-to-day tasks, right? As a more senior leader, you just cannot, right? You need to pick your battles. You need to decide what you do need to be involved in and what you just really need to be able to delegate to your team. It's case by case. There are going to be. I think of it as kind of zooming in, zooming out. Um, Under normal circumstances, you kind of zoom out, you help the team with the strategy, as we talked, you help the team, set up for success. And then, a lot of your time is spent with the leadership team, with the rest of the leadership team, looking 3 months out, 6 months out, on the strategy. And then, if something happens, a particular issue, a challenge, a performance issue, something that requires a lot more of your attention, then you zoom in and you help out. But like under normal circumstances, day to day, you kind of need to be zoomed out and you need to set up your team to be able to execute without you.
Gotcha. You mentioned a little bit ago, your experience before agile methodology was the norm. I wonder, as that became, all the rage and basically the only way that things get done
Yeah.
nowadays, what that transition looked like for you and how you actually feel about it today.
Let me first say that, a lot of people think of agile mostly in terms of all the rituals, without necessarily embracing what it was really meant to be, which is it's meant to really drive testing and experimentation and delivering as quickly as possible, as much value as possible. And with that angle, with that length, I love it. I think it makes a ton of sense. What's happening pre-agile was this, hundreds of pages long functional specification or business requirements documents. And ultimately, in many cases, when it was in fact ultimately delivered, nobody needed it, right? Because it's been a year, right? And the ship has sailed, and other priorities materialized. So no, I definitely am a big fan of agile. It just has to be with the right understanding of what it was intended to be.
When it comes to that agile methodology, do you feel that maybe there's an evolution that we could be moving towards of something that still gets us the benefits of those rituals without maybe getting distracted by just the going through the motions? Or is the value truly there and it's really just a matter of keeping it in mind and not doing the rituals for the ritual's sake?
I think the value is there. I think it's the education, and I think it's making sure that people understand what they're doing, both on the product side and on the engineering side.
I wonder, as you've kind of, your career, of course, has grown over time, and as you've experienced different kinds of managers above you, what has stood out to you when you were maybe earlier in your career as what made an excellent engineering manager? And what have you honed in on yourself, kind of maybe taking some of those learnings to be that excellent engineering manager for your teams?
I mean, you need to be able to trust your people, right? You need to create an environment where it's forgiveness versus permission. They don't need to run to you with every single question. They need to know what they're doing, why they're doing it. And you need to coach and mentor and make sure that they're being at their best, but you're not micromanaging. It's quite simple.
Were there instances of micromanaging managers in your in your actual experience where you thought, hey, this is something that I know I'll never do because this doesn't yield good results? Or what did that look like for you?
I mean, obviously, I think we all came across, managers, and not even necessarily, my direct managers, but, other people's managers, so other leaders. When you look at them or you are in the same room with them, and yes, and that's a lesson on, what not to do, as opposed to, a lesson of what to do. And obviously, I've seen both.
Sure. And I guess when it comes to being able to trust your team, that probably starts with, really a consistent hiring process, something that you know that the people that you bring in are trustworthy. What does that look like for you? Have you do you have really reliable methods of finding those individuals, or at some point is it you do have to take the leap of faith and then you find out on the job, or how does it end up panning out?
I mean, you can never learn everything about the person, during the interview process, right? So, but I think there are a few key things that you're testing for, and I think the most important one is kind of the low ego and ability to collaborate, because for the most part, technical skills, for the most part, you can teach, right? And people can get better at it. But if there's an engineer who could be amazing and great technically but cannot collaborate with others, that creates such a toxic environment for the team, where the rest of the team cannot function at their best. And ultimately that's like a lose-lose situation, even if that particular individual is great. So that's probably the most important thing to test for. Everything else is important, but a lot of it can be taught.
That sounds like a difficult thing to test for. How do you kind of suss that out during an interview process?
I mean, I usually, especially as I kind of grown into more senior roles, I very rarely bring my interview process, with me from organization to organization. So, I've worked with different organizations with, slightly different interview process, but typically there's always a part or, a type of an interview that gives an opportunity for a candidate and the interviewer to disagree, right? It could be there was a take home assignment, and then a follow up interview is both parties discussed decisions that went into that take home assignment, right?
Hmm.
And there's always going to be a question why you went this route versus that route, or take like an architecture interview similarly, right? You draw something on the whiteboard, and there's a question like why did you go this route versus that route, right? There's a way to discuss it in a collaborative manner, there's a way to discuss it in a defensive manner, right? And when you start hearing that defensiveness, when you start hearing that I know better, why do you tell me that I'm wrong, or I didn't do it as well as I could have, that's kind of where it starts, where you start seeing that lack of collaboration, and that notion of my way or highway, and I'm
Right.
right or I'm right.
Right.
Yeah.
And you bring up an interesting point too about the process sort of needing to fit the mold at each organization, maybe based on the culture. And so I wonder too, as you have worked as VP of engineering or even CTO at some of these companies, how much do you feel at liberty to shape the culture or change the culture? And I guess maybe a better question is, how do you know when to fit the mold versus when to break it
Yeah.
at these different positions?
I think it depends, right? So when you see that it's working, and by it's working, I mean like in the case of recruiting process, we find good candidates. They integrate with the team really well. They become productive pretty quickly. We retain them. We build a team that allows us to build a team that is diverse enough. When all of this happens, that means the process is working. So, right? So why fix what ain't broken? However, if it takes us forever to find a candidate, right? If we ultimately find a candidate and then the person leaves, in 6 months because either they were not the right fit, or from their perspective, or we realize that they were not the right fit, right? That means the process is not working. That means that, there needs to be an overhaul. And that's where, I would, sit with the engineering leadership and we would brainstorm. And, I might throw a few things that I did at my previous company, but I usually don't lead with that. I usually lead with, here's an issue, right? How do we solve it? Let's brainstorm. What have you done at your previous company? What have you done at your previous company? What worked? What should we do about it?
I wonder too if you feel a certain pressure when you're brought in that capacity. Even if things are working, is there a pressure to shake things up because you've been brought in and leave your own footprint? Or is that maybe an immature mindset? Or what do you think?
I mean, I think some people feel this way. And, I've worked with leaders who would come in and literally a month in or a couple of months in start reorganizing everything, right? Even though things were actually working, right? So I'm very mindful of not doing that just for the sake of doing it. And, I don't subscribe to this, I have to come in and put my own stamp on things. It's really, on a case by case basis. I start with talking to people. I start with listening to people. I start with meeting as many people as possible in my first 30, 60, 90 days. And that allows me to kind of watch for patterns of things where people told me themselves that certain things are not working, right? And if I'm hearing from a variety of people, and not just in engineering but maybe in product, or maybe in operations, or maybe even in finance, like if I'm hearing from enough people that something is broken, that's worth for me to zero in on and start reshaping and start figuring things out. If things are working well, if there are business results, if people are happy, why fix what ain't broken?
I wanted to ask specifically about how you've approached the challenges of scale as you've moved through the ranks, as you've worked with bigger and bigger organizations, and even as this relates to things like working with distributed teams and really just managing larger groups of people. Of course, at the most atomic level, when we're in IC, we're really just focused on what's directly in front of us. And I wonder, as you've moved from engineering manager to director to some of these higher level roles at bigger companies, how do you tackle the problems that come along with scale? What do those tend to be in your estimation? And have you found any secrets to success there?
I think the most difficult problem when you scale from a small team to a larger team is culture and how you maintain it. Because, when you have a small team, you kind of naturally interact with everybody on your team day in, day out, right? So all those things that we talked about, context, strategy, the why, what we are doing, you kind of naturally give that knowledge, to everybody on a smaller team. As the team gets bigger, that context often gets lost, and you don't notice it often until much later. When you start getting questions from people, and you're like, "Wait, I thought that was clear," and no, it actually wasn't, because in retrospect, we actually didn't talk about it, right? And it kind of slipped your mind. Or, as you become a manager of manager, you implicitly expect your managers, to be talking to their teams of all those things, but you didn't explicitly ask them to do it or mentor them to do it, especially if they're new to the role. Or, you didn't take the time to, share that context and that, that bigger picture situation with them, and it gets lost. And that includes values, and that includes, what we tolerate and what we don't tolerate. And it includes, how we work and all of that, right? Because again, implicitly, you kind of expect your directors and your managers to be doing all those things that you kind of in your head expect. But if you're not explicit about it, if they're not trained to do it, if they don't know how to do it well, then that culture starts getting lost, right? And then you're kind of surprised by people not quite behaving the way you expect them to behave, or the results not quite being the results that you expect.
So does it come down to ultimately process and having the right systems in place, or do you feel this is more case by case at different organizations?
Yes, it's definitely process, but it's also people, and making sure that the expectations are clear, right? In like that, those directors and managers, that they know that they expected to do X, Y, Z, and that they expected to communicate, and that they expected to, work with their team so that they understand the context and the culture and all of that, right? And kind of mentor their team along those lines. Yes, it's process, but there's only so much you can do with process because, a lot of it is just day to day and leading by example. So a lot of it is people too.
That makes sense. I guess when it comes to sort of on the same topic, when it comes to some of those processes, of course, the tech industry is, the fastest moving industry you could possibly work in. It means that to achieve success today may look different than what it looked like yesterday, may be different than what it'll look like tomorrow. What measures do you take to personally stay updated on industry trends? How do you encourage your team to do the same? And what does that end up looking like?
It's not easy. And it's not for the lack of information. It's actually quite the opposite. I think there's too much information out there in some cases. And, in some cases, you can just kind of go down the rabbit hole of reading, trying to absorb. I try to follow the leaders, if you will, people in my network, people, who I follow, and just people who I trust ultimately. And then I read and I listen and, I share a lot of it with my team and, kind of case by case.
And so it sounds in a lot of ways like it sort of falls back on that same tenet we mentioned about being able to trust the folks that you've brought in, right? Like you said, if you're able to follow your leaders, then you're in a good spot. When I think about, the actual impact of being a high level engineering leader, of course, zoomed in, I think it's very easy to measure impact because it's like, hey, my job as an IC is to ship this feature, let's say. And like, if I've done that, I can say, hey, I did a good job. And maybe there's only this many bugs I shipped and I could fix that with this sort of turnaround, maybe even DORA sort of metrics. But it becomes a lot more abstract at higher levels. I wonder how you personally measure the impact of your leadership or how you've gauged your own managers in this sense.
So I'm going to go back for a second to what you just said. While, often engineers think this way, I built a feature, I accomplished my goal. As much as possible, I always like to help people kind of focus their thinking in terms of outcomes as opposed to output. Because ultimately, it's not about the feature that we built, it's about the value that it created or didn't. Right? Why did we build this feature? Why do we think it's going to work? Why do we think the customers is going to like it? And what impact it's going to make, right? Is this that, we are going to be able to acquire more customers, retain more customers, increase the NPS? Like, what is the value? What is the outcome that we are working towards? And when you think about it this way, then it actually starts translating both from the bottoms up and from the top down, right? And when you think about it in that way, as a more senior leader, right, your job again is to say, okay, what is the strategy? What are we trying to accomplish as a company, right? And then you trickle it down, and then individual teams then get the ownership of part of that strategy, right? Maybe this team is responsible for customer acquisition and the outcome that they are working towards is, again, increase customer acquisition by 1%, in a quarter or whatever that number might be, right? It's then up to them between engineering and product and, maybe marketing, it's up to them to work together to figure out what are those features that we need to build in order to accomplish that outcome, and how can we test it as quickly as possible, as opposed to spending that entire quarter building something only to realize that, actually, like, our hypothesis was not right, and that's actually not going to work, right? And then we're in Q2 trying to do something else, right? So that's the mindset. It's often easier said than done. It's not always, easy and doesn't always translate to every single company and every single function. But that's where I always start, right? What are the outcomes that we are trying to achieve? And then try to give the teams as much autonomy as possible to figure out how to execute on those outcomes, as opposed to, having that laundry list of features to build.
Right. Yeah, no, I think that's such a great distinction. And you're right that sets even an IC up for success. If they can measure themselves in that way, then we have a consistent metric that translates all the way up the ladder instead of just thinking about, pure, like you said, output. That makes me wonder, how much do you stress understanding an engineer having a robust understanding of business goals, even at low IC levels, so that they really understand why decisions are getting made, why the initiatives that we're pursuing, how those directly affect customers or whomever? I mean, do you find that that ends up getting results if we're really keeping that in mind versus just saying, hey, go build A because B?
Super important, super important. Because like we don't think about it this way. We always think about they just need that. They just need to build that feature. Why do they need that context? But if you think about kind of day-to-day work that each engineer is doing, they need to make a bunch of decisions, right? Do I gold plate this feature, or do I just, build it in a way that would allow us to test it pretty quickly because we're just testing it, right? We don't know if it's going to kind of survive the test of, being put in front of the customer. So maybe I don't need to spend all this time building it in a perfect way, right? When they have that context, they can make that decision. And then that translates into, the speed, the expectations. It translates into, again, the ultimate results. But also, it also translates into people's happiness, right? Because we talked kind of at the very beginning, what brought me into software engineering, right? And it's problem solving, right? And it's, being able to make a difference, in someone's life, right? So a lot of people came to this field with this desire to make a difference, with this desire to be able to make their own decisions as they're solving those problems. So the more context they have, the more autonomy they're going to be able to have. And, ultimately, I feel like the happier they're going to be because they are allowed and empowered to make their decisions.
That makes a lot of sense. And I think probably does wonders for, as you said, really contributing to the work-life balance conversation and understanding the actual impact you're making with your work, right? To pivot a little bit, I want to make sure I ask you about this before I let you go, which is, I know you are affiliated, a member of, or even maybe a sponsor of the New York CTO Club. I'm curious if you could tell me a little bit about your involvement there and what those meetings are like, just some insight there.
I'm not a sponsor, but I'm a proud member. It's a great, it comes down to just a really great and supportive community. And, it's pretty amazing to just have exposure to all these people with their, collective, I don't know, hundreds of collective years of experience, in the field, and being able to have those conversations. So, if you want to know what the meetings are like, we typically get together, we have whatever, an hour or 40 minutes to just kind of chat. And then, there's usually a topic of a conversation, maybe a presenter, maybe just, a Q&A. And, and then if folks have time, then, we kind of talk a little bit more at the end. But my favorite part is actually that networking opportunity, at the very beginning, and just the ability to catch up and the ability to build relationships. Because ultimately, the more senior you become, kind of the lonelier it gets. You've heard that expression, it's lonely at the top, right? So the more senior you become, the less there are people like you in your company, right? At the same level as you are, right? Maybe if you're a director, maybe there's another director, or, depending on the size of the company, or maybe, a few, right? When you're a CTO, there's only one of you, right? So when you run into issues, when you try to figure things out, having that network of folks, that you can tap into and you can have a conversation, and you can kind of have that Chatham House rules, be open when you can be open, and, you can really get that advice. That's just priceless, absolutely priceless.
That is such a great point, because I didn't think about it in that context, but that makes a lot of sense why that would be so valuable. I guess I'd actually like to ask you, as right now you're have recently left Blue Apron, you're looking for what your next role is going to look like. How does an executive of your level sort of make those assessments? When you look around and think what your next big opportunity or challenge is, what does that process end up looking like for a CTO?
It's a good question. I've had this 4 4-point rubric for quite some time now, actually. Happy to share. It
Yeah.
basically comes down to people, product, what am I bringing to the table, and what am I going to learn, right? People is pretty obvious. It's super important for me to work with people who are collaborative, low ego, high EQ, people who don't want to spend or waste their time on politics, people who want to really focus on, delivering the business results and, moving the company forward, right? Product is super important for me. I need to be able to identify with the customers, and it could be any product. It could be, something direct to consumer. It could be a SaaS product. It could be, really any product, as long as I can kind of feel the value as a customer, because that's when, if I feel that pride and that value and, be able to put a kind of a customer's hat on and, drive it this way, then I can really help the team kind of feel the same way. Otherwise, I just wouldn't be able to be as passionate as I would like to be.
Mm-hmm.
And then, the last two is basically, obviously, I think all of us want to bring something to the table, right? I want to have relevant experience. I want to be able to come in, be helpful, help solve issues, whatever they're hiring the CTO for, right? But also, I don't want it to be same old, been there, done that, rinse and reuse, I want to learn something. I want to be challenged. So, it's for me, it's always, what's new to me that I'm going to learn, right? Like you mentioned Blue Apron. I had not worked in a food industry before Blue Apron. I had not had exposure to operations and fulfillment, and that was an incredible amount of new things for me to learn, but was super, super rewarding.
That is such a excellent rubric. I love that. Did you pick this up from somewhere, or where does this come from?
It just kind of crystallized. I mean, I think I did not think of it as a rubric initially, but
Mm-hmm.
then, as I kind of started, creating kind of a mental framework, I just basically turned, kind of all those thoughts, that's been in my head, into a little bit of more of a formal rubric there.
I love that so much. I think those are such important pillars of finding a good fit at that, whatever that next opportunity is. Definitely writing that down for my own use moving forward. I adore that.
Great.
Well, fantastic. Irina, I'm going to kind of wrap us up here. But before I let us go, I did want to just check in with you on like some super quick, maybe lighter fare here. One thing that I might ask you, is there a personal habit or routine that you found is a through line for you that has contributed to your ongoing success?
I realized that staying active is just incredibly important to me, whether working out or just, taking a walk or even like, having a meeting as working, on the go. It does wonders for my stress. It does wonders to just clear my head. It's something that, just kind of became, especially over the pandemic, it really became this habit that, I really, really, really follow, and I might not do something else, but, I usually try to kind of fit a workout in.
I think that's great. I love that. What's a piece of advice maybe that has resonated with you that you either wish you received earlier in your career or something that you have always come back to? Would anything like that stand out?
I got this great advice from a very, very experienced CTO who told me that I don't have to stick with one industry. I'm a technologist first and foremost. I can come into any company, any industry, learn about it, and ultimately understand what technology brings to the table and how technology helps propel the business forward. And for me, that was such a wonderful advice. And that's something that I've done pretty consistently. I moved on from e-commerce to educational software, from educational software to the Knack, which is a wedding planning marketplace. And, most recently, I was within the food industry. So that's really, really something that resonated with me, and hopefully I can continue following.
That's really all I've got for you, Irina. I appreciate you hopping in with us, chatting about this stuff. I think you've kind of given us, certainly me, a lot to think about. And I look forward to seeing what's next for you as you move on into your next role. I'll be following along with great interest. So thank you again. Anything else for today?
No, it's been great. It's been a lot of fun. Thank you for having me.
That's it today, everybody. Thank you so much for listening, and we'll catch you next time.